All right, welcome everyone. I think everyone's coming in. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Michael Umbe. I'm one of the members at the University Development Alumni and Relations Department. I want to thank you for joining us, particularly some of our donors. Your support helps generations of golden bears as well as the Berkeley community. In a moment, we will continue with the lecture, but first I want to give you some housekeeping tips. This session will be recorded. The audience is muted to make sure that we don't have any background noise. The chat feature is enabled, so please, if you have questions, please put them in there. It helps so that you can engage with the lecturer. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over this session to Linda Rafferty, the Director of Annual Fund and Alumni Engagement with the Rausser College of Natural Resources.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, as the case may be. We are so pleased today to have Elizabeth Hoover with us. She is Associate Professor at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at Rausser College. Elizabeth's research life and community work focus on food sovereignty and environmental justice for Native American communities. Based on collaborations with tribal communities across the United States, Professor Hoover has published books and articles about food sovereignty and seed rematriation, environmental reproductive justice, and tribal citizen science and community-based participatory research. And she also gets endless gratitude for us for coming to us from a dungeon in Italy where it is getting closer to midnight. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Hello, yes. Nice to join you all, even if it is an inconvenient hour here. But yeah, so why is a professor of Native American food sovereignty zooming in from Italy right now? So the reason why I am over here in Italy for the CADASAR, the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research conference presentation about agroecology and the arts is, if you think about what is Italian food without the influence of indigenous foods from the Western hemispheres, it doesn't look anything like what we would consider Italian food today, right? So I am zooming in today from a land that spent a lot of time colonizing the land of other indigenous peoples. And so if you think about tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, peppers, and a lot of other foods, chocolates, a lot of other foods that are very valuable to Italians today, those came from indigenous communities in especially the Western Hemisphere. So I am zooming in today from Spoleto, Italy. Most of my belongings currently live in Berkeley, where I teach at the University of California, Berkeley in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department, which is on Ohlone territory, unceded Ohlone territory, among people who are currently still seeking acknowledgement for their presence on that territory. And today I'm going to be talking about Native American food and seed sovereignty and some of the work that I've been doing over the last several decades around these topics. So first, to start with, what is food sovereignty? So this is a term that's really popular among academics and activists, and especially La Via Campesina is a self-described peasant organization that is comprised of land-based peoples across the world, but especially was first started in Latin America. And one of the definitions of food sovereignty that they came up with as part of the Declaration of Naileni in 2007, in which they brought together people from 85 different nations who came together to define what is food sovereignty for them. And the definition that they came up with was the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems, and the defining those systems being an important part of that definition. And this is a little different from food security, which is a term that shows up in a lot of public health publications and other studies, through the USDA, FAO, and other organizations, that is worried about populations that are consistently getting enough calories. So are you getting enough food on the regular to basically function. So this is how you make sure households are food secure. On the other hand, the food justice movement, their goal was ensuring access to equal access to safe and healthy food, and assurances that workers within the food system were treated fairly, and accounting for the value of food in relation to the self-determination of communities. So if we consider broadly the amount and type and quality of food available, whether it's within Berkeley, within the US, how do we assure that everybody who lives there has equal access to that food system? On the other hand, the food sovereignty movement is saying, okay, we don't just want equality within your current system. We want our own system. So one of my personal mentors, Winona LeDuc, who works with Honor the Earth and the White Earth Land Recovery Project, has described, okay, we don't just want an equal piece of the pie. We want our own pie. We want the ability to define our own pie within this system. And then on top of that, for Indigenous communities, there's sort of another layer of definition beyond that. So Indigenous food sovereignty is recognizing the social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing and that need to be nurtured as part of that food production system. And also recognizing the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships and to land-based food and political systems. So here is, for those of you who might not have taken a wide expanse of proper American history, some challenges to the Indigenous food and seed systems. It starts with scorched earth battle tactics. So in the 17th century, I come from upstate New York, from Mohawk territory, and the French came through in the 17th century and set fire to cornfields of communities of Haudenosaunee people who did not agree with the French politics. In the 18th century, you had General George Washington sent General Sullivan through Haudenosaunee territory again with the instructions to lay waste to their settlements for those communities who did not side with the Americans as part of the revolution. So his soldiers who came through there described burning millions of acres and bushels of corn, beans, squash, and other food supplies as a way of weakening these communities and forcing them to kind of come to the table of political negotiations. Then you had the intentional destructions of buffalo herds in the West that again starved out people and forced them onto reservations. For Navajo communities in the Southwest, there was the Long Walk that forced communities in the 19th century from the Four Corners areas up to Bosque Redondo, which was a concentration camp for Navajo people. And you had American heroes like Kit Carson, who were part of this effort to force people on this migration and who set fire to the sheep herds and the cornfield and the orchards, the fruit orchards that they relied on for food. So you had the intentional destruction of food systems by people who had come to control the American government. You had the theft of land and relocations. So for example, you had the Trail of Tears, where tribes from the Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole folks, who were forced on a death march from the southeastern part of the United States out to Oklahoma, where they had to relocate. And once getting to, if anybody's spent any time in Georgia and then spent any time in Oklahoma, that the landscape is very different. The soil is different, the weather is different. And so it was a lot harder to figure out how do you feed your community once you've been relocated to a very different environment. The Allotment Act, or the Dawes Sovereignty Act, that was passed in 1887, took these land bases, which had been set aside for tribes and which were communally owned, and said, okay, we can't do this communal ownership anymore, and then divided them up into individual parcels for tribal members, or people who qualified to be on the tribal rolls, depending on different qualifications at the time. And then the extra land was then sold off to other settlers. And so that further diminished the land bases in which tribes have the ability to provide food for themselves. The boarding school system, and it's the 1870s here, but it started even earlier on the East Coast, but kids were forcibly removed from their families and brought to these boarding schools for their entire youth. And they were taught to have a very different relationship with food in these schools than they had had as part of their families. Some kids went very hungry, but they were fed very differently, and they didn't learn some of the traditional methods of farming that they would have learned if they had stayed in their communities. The Bureau of Indian Affairs also promoted Western farming methods and seeds, even in communities that had been farming for millennia. So for example, in the Southwest, you have the Pueblo, the Hopi, the Zuni, who had been farming for a very long time, using dry land methods of farming and using heirloom seeds. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was like, no, you got to use irrigation. You have to use these kinds of hybrid seeds, and totally changed up their farming systems. And then they're like, oh, wait, this isn't working so good. Now your soil is salinated, and you should probably go back to the systems you had before. But when you have drastically interrupted these kinds of systems, sometimes that's not so easy. There was also the co-optation and commodification of native seeds by these non-native seed collectors, seed breeders, and agricultural companies at the same time that they were trying to get tribes to give up these kind of seeds and to be buying hybrid seeds. And then some of the more contemporary challenges to indigenous food and seed systems are climate change. So when you have adapted particular seeds for your precise environment, sometimes that can be changing when suddenly the amount of water, the type of weather you're having, as we saw even this past summer, is really quite different than you're used to. People are concerned about cross-contamination with genetically modified seeds. And then also in some communities, there's a lack of access to land, to tools, and to heirloom seeds themselves. So what happens when your seed and food systems are dramatically altered? Prior to 1940, there were very few cases of type 2 diabetes. And now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people. According to the US Indian Health Service, the death rate for American Indians because of diabetes is 249% greater than for other American ethnic groups. And there are also economic impacts. So the Warriors Land Recovery Project did a survey among their community in Minnesota and found that people on this reservation spent $8 million a year on food, and 7 million of which was spent off reservation. So then the thought became like, okay, how do we try to keep some of those dollars within the community? How do we support community members who are trying to produce food rather than having all of that money hemorrhaging out of the community? So those are the grim statistics. I know probably everybody's feeling like a little depressed right now, and I think it's important to recognize those grim statistics, but we don't want to get stuck there, right? We want to think about what are the positive things that people within the community are working to remedy some of these situations. So how are Native communities responding? There's a number of different farming and gardening projects that are going on all over the nation. I've spent a long time working with this group, where we are planting good seeds, who are based on the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation. And the efforts of this group, the intention of this group is, how do you support families who are trying to get back into farming and gardening and seed saving and feeding their families through local food? And so they're spending, a while working with folks in gardens and with, seed saving and taking care of animals. One of the questions that would come up as we were visiting and trying to figure out how to move the efforts of this group forward was, how are other tribal communities doing this? How are other people saving seed and getting youth involved and getting enough funding to keep these efforts going? And so to figure that out, I started going to different food sovereignty summits and meeting people from different tribal communities. And then I decided that I wanted to go and visit with all these different projects. So I took part in this epic road trip of 20,000 miles over 4 months during 2014. And I went to 39 different tribal communities. And I conducted 52 different interviews and 34 kind of conversations and field tours, following people through their gardens, through their cornfields, through their farmers markets with my recorder, and talking to people about, how are they defining food and seed sovereignty? How are they getting this work done? I also talked to 30 different seed keepers about, what is the work that's going into revitalizing and maintaining Native American seed varieties. I talked to 27 different Native chefs who are working on trying to get people excited about eating this kind of food. And then also 16 different participants in anti-pipeline work, anti-mining work, figuring out how do we protect the environment and make it a clean space to grow these kind of foods and seeds and other important ways of getting people back into eating the stuff on clean land. And some of the questions that I was asking Native farmers were, how did you get this organization started? What are some of the successes and challenges? How do you define food sovereignty? How do you decide what qualifies as an indigenous or heirloom or heritage seed? Where do you get your funding? Is there funding that you won't pursue or accept? Do you see yourself as part of the broader food movement? What kind of recommendations do you have for other organizations trying to start a project like yours? And I won't get to all of those today, but I'm happy to address some of these in the question and answer period if people have questions about those. As part of this, I started a blog called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement. That part of this was because, I was visiting with all these really cool folks and they were like, we'd like to really go around and just visit with everybody all summer. That sounds like a lot of fun, but we have to stay here and take care of the gardens. And so the blog was a way of letting each other know, like, what is everybody working on, giving some web exposure to some of these different organizations that maybe hadn't had the time to set up their own Googleable site in order to let their customers and funders know what they're working on. And so one of the first articles that I wrote out of this work is called "You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself, Defining and Enacting Food Sovereignty in Native American Community Gardening." And that was in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. And so as part of asking everybody, how are you defining food sovereignty? Some of the different threads that I pulled out of their definitions were focusing on the restoration of physical, cultural, and spiritual health as part of their work. So the reasons why they wanted to restore traditional foods to their communities. Focusing especially on culturally appropriate food. So it's not enough that everybody just grow a whole lot of kale on their farms, but making sure that they were growing the kinds of specific corn varieties and other heirloom food varieties that were very important to their particular communities. And also highlighting the relationship between people and each other, and people in the land, and people in the food itself. So really focusing on the relational aspects of food systems. And also highlighting the individual, community, and tribal self-sufficiency and control over food systems. So to what extent do people on an individual level exercise food sovereignty by deciding on a daily basis what they're going to put into their mouths, what kind of foods they're going to invest in? Also, economic independence. So, as mentioned earlier in the reference to that White Earth Land Recovery Project survey, thinking about, where are your food dollars going? Who are you supporting? So how can the community become more economically independent through making sure those food dollars stay within the community and making sure that people in the community have access to that food? A big part of food justice work is about, for people who are low income, to what extent do they have access to this nice, healthy food? How do we make sure that even members of the community who don't have money are still able to eat this healthy food? And education was a big part of a lot of these food sovereignty projects. So educating people to want to make the choices to invest in these kinds of foods, to get people thinking more about the nutritional content and the historical context of the food that they're investing in. And thinking about food sovereignty as a movement, as a process, not necessarily a final destination. So some people are like, oh, we're never going to be food sovereign because we're on this teeny little patch of land and we'll never be able to produce all the food that we can eat for ourselves. And then other communities recognizing that trade networks have always connected people from different communities. So thinking about, how do you trade for those foods that you can't grow yourself? How do you make sure that whatever foods you're bringing in, that you have a relationship with those food producers? And a big part, because I was focusing specifically on farming and gardening communities. Now, granted, the Native American food sovereignty movement is huge, and it covers people who are foragers, fishers, hunters. There are many ways to get food. And so I was focusing specifically on farming and gardening movements. And so because I was looking specifically at farming and gardening, there was a real focus on continuing and revitalizing the use of traditional heirloom seeds. So not just, going to your Burpees catalog in the fall, or going to your local ag store, or even the Walmart garden center to get your seeds, but instead utilizing seeds that have been passed down within the community, within the family for many years, and recognizing the importance of those seeds because they contain that connection to community. So for example, one of the projects I went to visit at Coche Pueblo, the Coche Youth Enrichment Project, there they partner young folks with farmers in order to, throughout the summer, get them to apprentice and understand what goes into this kind of dryland farming and seed saving. And so in talking to Jason and, his grandma Percy, these seeds, he guesses, have always been in the family. They don't remember a time when they did not have access to these seeds. And sometimes they let them grow a little close to each other, which is why, the blue corn's got some white speckles in it and the white corn's got some blue speckles with it. And that's okay. The genes are mingling between the different varieties and they're okay with that. But again, Jason felt like it was really important to carry on with those particular varieties of seeds because, that's what they need for their special ceremonial foods for their events. And he said, if we don't have them here, where will we get these? So some seeds have always been in the community. Other seeds have gone out of the community. They're kind of like, the prodigal seed children, and they've been gone for a while. And so there's a seed rematriation movement to help them come home. So for example, you see Tiana here holding this beautiful green squash. And so this is a type of Taos squash that hadn't been grown in a long time. And Rowan White, who has that red shawl over her shoulder, she's a Mohawk seed keeper who became the chair of the board of the Seed Savers Exchange. And when she joined that organization, it's a big seed bank and public access seed bank in Decorah, Iowa. And she was curious to know how many Indigenous seed varieties were part of the seed bank, and did Indigenous people from whom these seeds were originally collected still have access to them. And so she began, instructing that all of these different varieties should be grown out and brought back to the community. And so this particular Taos squash, this conference was held in September of 2019, I think it was. So before there was a big lockdown and we got to do a whole lot of conferences and visiting. But Rowan, we Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, I'm a board member of, and Rowan was a program director of for a while, hosted this conference at Taos Pueblo, and she brought one of these squashes out there. And people had a really emotional homecoming for the squash that hadn't been grown in the community for about 70 years. And people cradled it like a baby, as you can see, they're really welcoming it home, and people were tearful. And it really was like a homecoming for the seed. So some have always been in the community and some are being welcomed home and welcomed back into people's gardens. So the idea of seed sovereignty is the rights of farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-raised seed, and having that valued over the plant breeders and agrochemical firms' intellectual property rights. And so, concerns about whether seeds are going to be patented or modified and how that might impact community members' ability to continue the relationship with seed. So when I asked different seed savers and seed keepers, like Clayton Bracape, you can see here, he's a Mohawk seed keeper who's lived in Tesuque Pueblo for the last 4 decades or so, and he helped to found the Traditional Native American Farmers Association. And he defines seed sovereignty as protecting our living relatives so they can't be molested, contaminated, or imprisoned. And what he meant by molested was, he said that, somebody takes our seed relative and cuts it apart on a genetic level, we consider that a molestation of our relative. Like, you shouldn't be treating our relative that way. And by contaminated, if you plant your seeds and genetically engineered corn pollen blows into your field and contaminates your field, then how do you save those seeds? How do you trust those seeds? And in prison, he said, if somebody comes and patents your heirloom seed varieties, you can't interact with it in the same way. You can't trade and sell it in the same way that you might have otherwise. So he describes seed sovereignty as the inherent right to save seed and pass it on to future generations. And then Rowan, who you met a few slides ago, talks about seed sovereignty as the ability to define our relationship to that seed based on our own values and not the value of anyone else outside of our community. So some ways that communities are protecting seeds are through indigenous seed banks. So Tesuque Pueblo, which is the Pueblo where Clayton, who was on the previous slide, lives, has this beautiful cob adobe building that is a seed bank, and it's below ground, and it has all these shelves where community members can store seeds at this very kind of climate controlled situation. To the right is a shelf or among a whole seed library by the Gun Lake Potawatomi. So there are communities who are developing their own seed libraries, seed banks, in order to protect and save seeds right within the community, as opposed to sending them off to the other side of the world for someone else to protect. There's also the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is a program through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance that hosts a number of different events and workshops and educational opportunities, including seed exchanges. And so this is one from one of the Indigenous farming conferences you see here on the left. There's different hand pollination classes. You can see Zach Page here through the White Earth Land Recovery Project teaching one of these hand pollination classes to help people to keep their corn from being crossed with other local varieties. There's a Upper Midwest Indigenous Seed Keepers Network seed program. So again, this organization is meant to bring together different Indigenous communities so that they're able to share, exchange knowledge and seed. And then I mentioned seed rematriation. So some people have probably heard of repatriation, which, you know, when prisoners of war are returned to their own country, they're said to have been repatriated, or many people have been introduced to the term through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, in which ancestral remains and sacred objects are sent home to their original tribal nations. And it's really this one-way process where things that should not have been separated from their home country are then returned home. And so the term rematriation was coined and created as a way of coming up with a term that wasn't quite so patriarchal sounding, right? It's a way of honoring those seed keepers, those women seed keepers, especially those grandmas who are responsible for season after season deciding which seeds get saved and kept for the next generation. And it's a more circular process instead of these kind of one-way arrows. So it's a way of connecting Indigenous people to the seeds, connecting those seeds to the motherland for which they were developed, and then in the process, reconnecting Indigenous people to the land. So here's a couple of different seed rematriation projects, and I don't want to take too long, but if people have questions, I'm happy to address those in the question and answer period. But I talked a little bit about the Seed Savers Exchange efforts to get home some of those Indigenous seed that are in their collection. I've been working with the Field Museum on returning some seeds to the Meskwaki tribe and hopefully eventually others. And then also the Hearst Museum that I work with now that I'm a faculty member at Berkeley, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The Science Museum in Minnesota was among the first that kind of dug into their collections to see, okay, who are their Indigenous seeds that are in here and who might they want to go home to? The Pawnee Seed Preservation Project, so the Pawnee tribe in Oklahoma that did a lot of work to reach out and try to track down and reconnect with their heirloom seeds that didn't make it on their forced relocation walk to Oklahoma from Nebraska and Kansas. And then the University of Michigan and some of their efforts there to bring seeds out of the museum and plant them and send them home. So the rematriation projects are really an effort of identifying where those collections of seeds are. And often these were seeds that were collected just to sort of have a symbolic notion of the kinds of things that people were planting. And instead of keeping them in the collections as a timepiece frozen forever, saying, okay, to what cases are there communities that might want to be reconnected to these seeds and actually plant them again and get them back into gardens and back onto people's plates. So you can grow all of these great seeds, but one of the challenges is how do you get people excited about eating them? So one of the chapters in the book that I am currently working on is about Native chefs and gastro-diplomacy, or how do you educate the broader public about Native culture through Indigenous foods? So looking at how do you define and create traditional foods? So for some people, traditional foods are only ingredients that existed in the Western Hemisphere pre-contact. For other people, there are foods that have been included more recently that they consider traditional if people have been using them for a long time and consider them culturally important. And so the fry bread debate fits into part of this. So for any of you who haven't had fry bread, it's basically fried dough. It's, white flour fried in lard. And this was a food that people created, especially after tribes were given rations when they were moved onto reservations so that they wouldn't starve. Fry bread was a way of making a high calorie food that would keep people alive. And so now that most people aren't in that situation of such intense food insecurity that they're going to starve, people are looking to fry bread and saying, okay, this is not good for people that have diabetes or obesity and other issues. How do we get rid of fry bread because it's an unhealthy food? And other people say, well, this is a culturally important food because this is something that the women in our ancestry came up with as a way to feed us. And so there's a big debate about whether to cancel out fry bread entirely or whether to just keep in moderation in honor of those women, but also kind of move towards some of these more healthy traditional foods. There's also issues around culinary appropriation. So as Native chefs are developing the concept of an Indigenous cuisine, how do you ensure that the ability to profit off of this venture is offered first to Native chefs and not just sort of taken up by chefs from other ethnicities who want to jump on the newest and most exciting trend? And then many of these chefs also are facing the balance of feeding their community, but also feeding a well-paying foodie public. And so many, like you see this beautiful iCollective dinner that happened in New York City a few years back. There were dinners that were offered to the Native community in New York City for free. And then there were other dinners that were, very fancily plated that were offered to a well-paying public that could then subsidize some of those dinners for Native people. So gastro-diplomacy is sort of this idea of winning hearts and minds through stomachs, the introduction of foreign culture through cuisine, as some people call it, sort of a non-threatening way of introducing culture, and enhancing cultural understanding, cultural visibility. And so some of these different chef groups kind of called this, having uncomfortable conversations over dinner. So serving these dinners while at the same time educating people about some of the issues facing Native communities. And then one of the last chapters that I'm covering in this book is about where environmental justice and food justice efforts are coming together. And so it's titled, "You Can't Drink Oil, Water Protectors, Wendigo Slayers in the Fight for Environmental Justice and Food Sovereignty." So thinking about how food justice requires environmental justice, and thinking about infrastructural violence of where pipelines are sited. So often we don't think about infrastructure because we don't see it. But when all of a sudden you have an infrastructure project about to be plowed through your community that will ultimately leak and destroy your food source, people become very aware of it. And so there's a lot of effort right now to stop Line 3 in Minnesota so that it won't destroy food sources there. So originally, this is in 2014, the Love Water Not Oil horse rides were drawing attention to the proposed Sandpiper pipelines, which would cross the rice beds in Minnesota. That pipeline was ultimately stopped, but now Line 3 is going. Traditional foods at the Ochete-Shakoi camp that was supposed to stop the Dakota Access pipelines. So again, this is where traditional foods were utilized as a way of supporting water protectors who were trying to prevent these pipelines from coming through, in this case, through Standing Rock Sioux tribe territory in North Dakota. The Ponca tribe planted some of their heirloom corn in the path of the Keystone Pipeline in Nebraska, again, is sort of creating this path of, you shall not cross here with your dirty infrastructure project over our land that was already taken and which is now planted with these heirloom corns. And then in Wisconsin, there was a big effort to keep out of mine and to really focus people on some of these other kind of food sources like maple syrup, and hosting these harvest educational learning projects camps to get people to rethink what are the resources that can be drawn from this place. And also thinking about how food sovereignty is really a growing international movement. So I've had the opportunity to attend international indigenous corn conferences in Mexico and Belize, and hearing from other indigenous communities who are facing a lot of the same issues that Native North Americans are facing around preserving heirloom corn varieties and getting this food back onto people's plates and into people's diets. And really what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was sort of the illumination of some of the problems within the food system. And so really some of the folks that I had interviewed who were trying to get people back into gardening and farming and saying, okay, people are really now, all of a sudden that the grocery store shelves are empty, everyone's extra excited about how do I actually plant a garden? All those things you've been harping on all this time, maybe now I should listen to you and actually get on that. And I have a few essays that I'm happy to share with people around those details. So in conclusion, in the Hearst Museum, there's a number of seeds in the collection that we're now looking at to say, and this is Leke, who was a graduate student in ESPM, who helped me to go through and catalog some of these seeds, and to figure out like, how can we connect some of these different communities that the seeds were collected from, who might want to come visit with these seeds and learn from them. And then we also have the Indigenous Community Learning Garden at the Oxford tract, which is working to connect students with this space, with California indigenous plants, but also with different heirloom seed varieties from the communities that these students are coming from. And then Cafe Oloni, who I talked about briefly earlier, we're working on bringing them to the Hearst Museum. So their original pop-up restaurant spot was closed down when the university bookstore closed, but now working to bring them to the Hearst Museum as well. So at this point, I think I might have gone over by a few minutes. Thank you for y'all's patience, but I am happy to entertain any questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was fascinating. We've got a number of questions, so we'll get right to them. Tell us something about where support for food sovereignty comes from. Is it from the indigenous communities themselves or the federal government through BIA or through nonprofits?
So that really depends on the opinions of different communities. So as I mentioned, one of the questions that I asked people was, is there funding that you will or will not accept? And some people said, you know what, we will not accept funding from anything federally connected, because how can you decolonize if you're taking money from the entity who colonized you? So if you want to be sovereign, you can't be accepting colonized money. And other people said, you know what, there is no such thing as clean money. It's all dirty. So give me your dirty Walmart money and I will raise nice food and I will feed my community. So people really had differing opinions on where it would come from. A lot of people look to indigenous run foundations like the First Nations. Oh, I'm blanking right now, but if you Google First Nations, they're an excellent foundation. The Indian Collective has also, NDN is how you spell that, has also provided a lot of important seed funding for these kinds of groups. You have Honor the Earth, which has given seed grants to a lot of folks. And then you have, different groups that have, the Native Conservancy in Alaska has worked hard to raise funding to support community food sovereignty efforts there. So you have these, the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance that I work with has also worked to kind of raise funding and then provide seed grants. Natives, which is the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, is a nonprofit that's working to support different community food efforts and creation of indigenous food labs so that people can develop their own recipes and restaurant entrepreneurial businesses. So I think, it started with a lot of outside foundations. It started with a lot of kind of USDA funding. And then it sort of has been shifting a little some of these more indigenous run foundations. And, in some communities, people have used casino funding to then funnel toward the tribal farm. So it really differs from one space to the next, how some of these projects are funded.
Right. One of our guests commented that your road trip missed Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, which have such large indigenous populations. Did you talk with those tribes, and perhaps share with us why you chose to talk to the people that you did talk to?
Yeah, so Montana, Wyoming, you have a lot of ranchers there. Not a lot of gardeners, not a lot of people who are working on community-based farming and gardening projects, at least at that time in 2014. There have been some efforts that have small efforts that kind of popped up since then. So I wasn't talking to conventional farmers and I wasn't talking to ranchers particularly. So these were community-based farming and gardening projects, and especially those who were focusing on heirloom seeds. So for spaces where people haven't spent as much time as part of their, horticultural background focusing on those things, I didn't spend as much time in those spaces. So I've since gone back, my partner's from Crow, so I've started spending more time in the Montana area. But again, people are real into the ranching. They don't have the kind of soil there that's really conducive to a lot of this kind of growing.
Can you discuss your ideas on whether non-tribal members should grow or save certain seeds?
Yeah, so when I talk to people, one of the folks I visited with, my dear friend Josh, who is a member of Ganahio, his theory was, you know what, the more people who grow these seeds, like the broader the genetic sweep. And all of a sudden, like your corn variety is everywhere. And if something happens to your seed stock, you have a lot more people to draw on. So I think the only reticence that people had to non-native people growing heirloom seeds was those occasions when people were like, okay, now I'm going to profit on this. I'm going to name this after myself. I'm going to start commercially growing this and selling it to chefs in this area, is where one of the groups had a issue with it. So for people who wanted to grow these seeds in their gardens and feed their family and feed their community and give these seeds to their friends and develop their own personal relationship to these seeds, I don't know anybody who has a problem with that. The issue became more of what happens when people try to commercialize and sell these heirloom seeds that have been developed as a result of many generations of grandmas before you that weren't your grandmas, but now you want to sell these seeds. And so if you want to sort of tag on as a adopted cousin and hang out and just plant those seeds, that's different from trying to co-opt that whole family and then sell those seeds.
Right. Can you tell us something about the people engaged in the food sovereignty movement? Anything about the demographics? Are these tending to be younger people or people that are looking to continue tradition? And are they working with other various food movements in general, with eating locally or seasonally, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, the age groups tend to be all over. There's a real desire to connect elders and youth as part of this. So you have youth that have all this energy, and you have elders that are like, oh, nobody wants to plant the seeds. Okay, let's connect them to the people who will have the energy once we get them excited about it. So you have organizations like Dream of Wild Health in Minnesota that focus specifically on urban Native youth. They give them these internships, they drive them up from the Twin Cities to the farm every day in the summer. And those youth learn how to plant and tend and care for and manage and harvest and cook and sell all of this produce. And at the same time, they have elders that they hire to come hang out and guide and visit the youth while they're taking care of all these seeds. And so there are a number of programs like that that I visited with where there's a real effort of connecting these age groups as a way of continuing giving life to this movement. And there were also, when it comes to setting up at farmers markets, there are alliances that these Indigenous organizations and other local growers have made to establish these farmers markets and to establish local food policies in that way. So in some cases, some of them are very focused on their particular reservation community or their particular local community, but at the same time see a value in partnering with other local farmers to, get that produce sold and people eating healthy.
Now, for a very non-academic question, I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to go out and eat Native American foods now. For those of us who live in the Bay Area, other than the pop-up, which may be reopening, are there any places that we can go?
You are so in luck because Crystal Wapapa, this amazing Kickapoo chef who has had a catering business for some time now, who has lived in the Bay Area her whole life. Her relatives are from Oklahoma. She was raised in the Bay Area. She's an amazing cook. Her food is so delicious. And her restaurant is going to open at the end of this month in Fruitvale. It's called Wapapa's Kitchen. The interior is beautiful. The menu is beautiful. Her food is gorgeous. So we are so excited that there's going to be a full-time restaurant. And really, you know, she's like the third in the country that I can think of right now who's a native chef focusing specifically on native cuisine. And so aside from, you know, Chef Sherman has Awamni in Minneapolis, if anybody's tuning in from there. Ben Jacobs, who's an Osage chef, has Tokabe in Denver. And now we have, you know, Loretta Bear Oden was one of the first who started a restaurant in Santa Fe. And, you know, that restaurant's no longer open, but now she is opening a cafe at a museum in Oklahoma. But Crystal is starting this restaurant in the Bay Area, and I plan on hosting all of my meetings there from here on out.
Wonderful. We have a couple minutes. Can you elaborate on what you mean as the uncomfortable conversations in your discussion of gastro-diplomacy?
So one of the things that the I Collective was focusing on, you know, they hosted a series of meals over Thanksgiving. And the narrative, the sort of false American narrative about Thanksgiving that most people engage in is like, oh, this time of great coming together. And like the indigenous people and the pilgrims like had this lovely meal together and everybody conversated and it was, you know, fantastic. And everybody got along great. And then nobody pays attention to what happened afterwards. And actually there was a lot of bloody, you know, massacres and land theft that happened after that. And so the uncomfortable conversations that they were hosting was about, you know, what does Thanksgiving really mean? What does it mean that, you know, really for the first English settlers, the Thanksgivings were after the massacres. They were like thanking God that they survived this massacre of all these indigenous people. Well, at the same time, you know, indigenous people in the Northeast have been having Thanksgiving for millennia, every different season, you know, thanking for, you know, the seed blessings, for the green beans, for the strawberries, for the harvest ceremonies. And so the uncomfortable conversations were thinking about, you know, what does it mean that the Thanksgivings that were celebrated by European Americans were most often around massacre and land theft? And how is that being carried out through the continued colonization of Latin America and other spaces where indigenous people are actively having their land snatched up, while indigenous people in the US are actively still fighting for recognition and control over land. And so getting people to think about that and not just being like, oh, Thanksgiving's so cozy and great, but how do we actively work toward recognizing what was lost while being, you know, you could still be thankful for your family and your food and, you know, the things that make us happy at night, but also recognizing, you know, whose land are you on while you're being thankful for your family and your food, and how do you support those communities in actively retrieving and re-engaging with their own resources.
Mm-hmm. And for the last question, what is it in this movement that gives you hope?
That gives me hope. Eating really well, and how many beautiful, it doesn't have to be always uncomfortable conversations around food. Like how often have you had beautiful conversations around food? I mean, seeds are so helpful. If you have ever seen a bean sprout, like how can you not be excited and hopeful? They're amazing. Like you have this big fat bean and then this little sprout, this little plant comes out. Like it's so beautiful. Every seed that sprouts is so incredibly beautiful. And everybody who gets excited alongside you with every bean that sprouts is so beautiful. And every time you learn about a new food and that you sit down to eat with people is amazing and hopeful. So that's what keeps me excited, is all the good food, the beautiful seeds, and the beautiful people that are planting all the good seeds and who continue to be excited even after, you know, centuries of oppression. People are like, yeah, there's that, but then there's the millennia of beautiful culture that came before and will continue after this time of oppression.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And this has been recorded. So if our viewers have other people they'd like to share with us, it will be online, as well as many other fascinating lectures from homecoming, and we will all look forward to seeing you at the new restaurant in Fruitvale.
Wapaba's Kitchen.
Thank you.